Thank you, Giuseppe, for introducing us. And yeah, as Giuseppe said, we belong to the specific group of degrowthers who are committed to the transformation of the food system, both academically but also politically. And then I don't think I need to say a lot on this anymore. Why is food interesting for degrowthers? Well, as Giuseppe again just said, because on the one hand, the industrial food system as it stands now is a perfect expression of the hegemony of growth in our society. And we see the detrimental consequences on social and ecological justice. But at the same time, the food system has equally provided key inspirations for degrowth. So degrowthers themselves have been inspired by oppositional and agrarian and rural movements in the food system, such as La Via Campesina or the Zapatistas. And they have been inspired by a wide array of agricultural grassroots initiatives that experiment with post-capitalist ways of producing and consuming food. And these initiatives, as they create utopias, one may say in the now, they often also referred to as nowtopias. And roughly, one could say that these struggles and these initiatives could be seen as part of the wider movement that is called food sovereignty. And many of these initiatives and practitioners can also be said to practice what is called agroecology. And I thought these are two very important terms, and for those of you who are not familiar with them, I just want to give very brief definitions. So food sovereignty is both a vision and a social movement. It was launched in the 1990s by the global agrarian movement La Via Campesina, and was defined, for instance, here in 2007, it was defined, and I read and quote, as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food, produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. And I left a longer definition here on the slide because I thought it was nice to see in some other words that come up, how degrowth and food sovereignty actually really aligned in what they ask for and what they fight for. And then the second term was agroecology. It's often understood as an ecological approach to farming, which it is, but it's more than that. In the food sovereignty struggle, agroecology is a way of life, a practice that is inextricably linked to a political practice of overcoming the current corporate-controlled food system. So it's a science, it's a practice, it's a movement. Okay, and what we want to do now is asking, well, what can degrowth now add? What can it add to these movements that are there? And what can it also add to other forms of critiques of the capitalist food system that have long been articulated also from other academic communities? So first, can degrowth as an academic paradigm add new perspectives to thinking of food transformation beyond capitalism? And then second, can degrowth as a social movement be a valuable ally to existing struggles, so such as for food sovereignty and agroecology? And the first part I leave to Jacob.
I will try. So yes, in the first part, we'll look together in what ways degrowth theories are useful for understanding food system transformation beyond capitalism. As Giuseppe hinted at, originally degrowth has proposed a rather structural approach by focusing on the ideology and institutions of growth and capitalism. But more recently, more like sectoral approaches have emerged, and people have started to study degrowth in relation to urban planning, in relation to tourism, and also now in relation to food. And we believe that degrowth has interesting things to say about the food system in two ways. First, because it identifies the roots of unsustainability in today's food system. And second, because it can actually help us think about change and transformation and strategy in interesting ways too. So first thing first, degrowth actually identifies capitalism and the ideology of growth as the root drivers of unsustainability in the current food systems. And what degrowth says is that individual or separated interventions in the current food system, is this again? Yeah. These technological innovations alone do not suffice, and they will actually never lead to socially just and ecologically sound food systems. So degrowth also says that it doesn't make any sense to single out individual culprits like conventional farmers, for the crisis of nitrogen, biodiversity loss, and climate change that are now happening. Because degrowth actually allows us to look at the different pressures that the different pressures that the capitalist food system actually puts on all food system actors. And it doesn't only zoom out like structurally, but it also zooms out to look at the history of political decisions that have been made in favor of productivist agri-food system, in favor of industrial farming. So, of course, this zooming out, it doesn't mean that we should not question or challenge the attitudes and the actions, for example, of conventional farmers in the farmers' protests. But in the way Jan Douwe van der Ploeg explained, in the light of the farmers' protests, the conventional farmers in the global north, so also in the Netherlands, they have both been victims of capitalist policies, but they have also internalized capitalist subjectivities, and they reproduce these capitalist subjectivities. So in this way, it means that they are not just victims of capitalism, but they are not just agents of environmental destruction either. They're actually both at the same time, which makes it complicated. What degrowth can do here is actually advocate for a shared problem framing around the capitalist hegemony of growth and the impact it has on these farmers and on food systems. And it should do so in a way that actually farmers can relate to. Because what we actually see is that many conventional farmers have been attracted to right-wing populist movements that give some voice to their anger about the blame that is being put on them. And this anger is legitimate, and degrowth recognizes it. But many of these farmers do not question the ideology of growth, do not question industrial agriculture, and we believe degrowth theory should actually help here to take a step towards them and connect with them on these issues of actually singling out the capitalist system as mainly or responsible for the situation. So degrowth says that food systems can only become sustainable if we take a radical break away from the current system. But this demands deep collective efforts and new coalitions, new alliances. Together with our colleagues, we've developed a workshop that analyzes the effects of the structures and institutions and values of capitalism in food system. And in the workshop, we actually delve into the core elements of capitalism, the core elements that underpin the growth society and that actually influence the food system. And examples of these elements are private property, individualism, you see some of them on the slide, unpaid and gender care work. And what we do in the workshop is actually describing how these institutions condition unsustainability in the food system and how they also hinder transformation to more sustainable food systems. An example here is if we want to reach a future in which we want to be mostly fed by small-scale agroecological farming, then we have to question the centrality of private property. We have to question the commodification of agricultural land. We have to question the competition between different types of land use, between land used for energy production, land used for food, land used for industry, land used for housing. And these structural factors, it make access to land almost impossible for young farmers. And so then degrowth has to think okay, changes in these property regimes, for example, changes that make collective property easier, or changes that allow for a democratic deliberation on what do we use our available lands for, these type of changes might actually pave the way for agroecological transitions, but they are the structural obstacles. What we did together with workshop participants is actually to think about strategies to dismantle these structural obstacles and to realize more sustainable food systems. What degrowth does is that it actually reminds us that it's not sufficient to just create new alternative ways of organizing food systems, of producing food. It's also necessary to develop strategies to unmake and dismantle those values, those practices and institutions that are actually continuously perpetuating environmental destruction and social injustice. we've made this workshop toolkit available online, so it's free for anyone to use, to take parts of it, to, if you want to launch a collective discussion about degrowth and capitalism and food system transformation, you can take a look there. And the second way in which degrowth is useful, we believe, is in the way it helps us think about strategies for transformation. And so, as we first saw with the workshop, you can strategize to unmake very structural aspects of capitalism, like the ones put here. This is not an easy task. There's also other ways of thinking about transformation. For example, thinking specifically about sectoral transformation. So thinking about degrowth transformation of the food system. What would that mean? What new institutions, new practices would emerge in this transformation of the food system? And a question we can ask here, for example, is how a reform of the common agricultural policy, which determines a lot of the possibilities on food production, consumption, and provisioning, how could this reform support food system transformation? Another example is cross-sectoral transformation, which means actually looking into the effect of transformation in other sectors on the food system. For example, if there's a big reform in housing policy which actually freezes the rent or limits the rent one has to pay for their housing, how can this impact new food consumption practices? How can this impact the food system? These are types of questions that degrowth actually asks. And more recently, debates have shifted from determining a degrowth vision of society and even of food systems to the question of how to get there, the pathways that Giuseppe mentioned before. Different strategies have been proposed, and there's some more symbiotic strategies which are mainly about policy reform and working together with institutions to obtain change. There's also interstitial strategies, which are mostly about prefiguration and building alternatives in forms of co-ops or whatever. And finally, there's ruptural strategies, which consist of more direct attacks on capitalist or statist institutions. We won't go too deep into this, but the questions these strategic approaches relate to are questions about the role of the nation state. So what should we do with the nation state in transformation? Should we work with it? Should we work against it? Should we destroy it? Should we just make it obsolete? Also, the question raises what type of change is actually needed? How does meaningful change occur? And how can you consolidate change? And finally, also in the context of ecological breakdown, how fast does change need to happen to be effective? What we should keep in mind in all of these discussions about transformation is that transformation always happens from within capitalism. And this means that the actors that work towards food system transformation, they usually struggle to survive in a system that prioritizes private property, profit accumulation, competition. So it's not easy to just do things differently because there's a whole system in which we are ingrained. And this also comes with the risk of capitalist cooptation. So capitalism usually integrates its critiques and is very flexible in adapting to changing circumstances. So an obvious example here is how all big supermarkets now have a big offer of local and organic food because they know that they can get money out of this because people want to buy healthy food. And so what we believe it's useful here is to keep an explicit anti-capitalist reading of degrowth, to actually keep a focus always on how capitalism evolves, how capitalism adapts to the conditions, and to see at every moment where there are specific leverage points for change. And I will leave the mic to Yuli for the second part. You want this one or?
I think this is still working. Yeah. Just need to switch. Yeah. Yes. So as I announced in the beginning, the second part of our question is about degrowth as a social movement. And it is still being debated if degrowth actually is a fully grown movement or if it might more be something like a movement in emergence. But for this talk right now, let's just focus on the fact that degrowth is for sure a political project. And as such, the degrowth community includes, next to academics, also activists and practitioners, so people who engage in climate activism, in community economy initiatives, or who develop policy proposals. And yeah, therefore it is, well, still quite useful to ask what degrowth as a movement can bring. Can it be a valuable ally for established social movements? Particularly, as I introduced also earlier, movements that can be understood quite broadly as gathered under the banner of food sovereignty and agroecology. And in our PhD research, in the Unmaking project, we have worked on one specific social movement within the struggle, which is the community-supported agriculture movement. For those of you who are not familiar with CSA, as it is abbreviated, CSA is an initiative that connects food producers to consumers, with then the consumers committing to bearing collectively the costs and risks of the farm, and in return the consumers receive a share of the harvest. So what happens in this initiative is that together as a community they create something of a shield that protects food producers from the pressures of a competitive food market. So farmers do not depend on fluctuating food prices on the market anymore, but instead producers are supposed to being able to focus on producing healthy and ecological food for their community. And then because of this innovative mechanism, Degrowth sees CSA as a present-day example of degrowth in the food system. And so one could say that degrowth and CSA have aligned values. They kind of want the same. And therefore the degrowth movement could be a useful ally for the CSA movement, simply because they work towards similar goals. Okay, what actually we have observed in our research in Germany, so on the CSA movement in Germany, that is, when I say we, that is my colleague Leonie, who isn't here, and I, is that we noticed that things aren't that straightforward. So while the degrowth movement sees CSA as really an important agent of change, the CSA movement does not seem to have taken much notice of degrowth. And so what we have been looking at in our research is just the question of why. What is currently keeping the two movements from working together in the case of Germany? And I'm sharing some brief findings from that research. The first obstacle that we found was a question of framing, we called it. So what are the two movements concretely aiming to achieve? What do they say they want? And what do they say is the problem? And so on the one hand, there's a CSA movement, that's a practical movement. So it's rooted in the realities of smallholders and their struggle to survive in a competitive market. And they have a concrete and practical goal as a movement. They want to spread the idea of CSA and they want to help farms to transition into that model. And then on the other hand, you have the degrowth movement, which is mostly an intellectual movement and particularly strong in its discourse and a bit less strong in its practice. So degrowthers start from a critique of the hegemony of growth, and they want a transformation towards a degrowth society. And while I'm saying these words, that's extremely abstract. So you see that there's a difference between practice and discourse as the strength and the framing of these movements. And what this then brings me is also the next obstacle for a collaboration between the two movements is that they represent slightly different social groups. So then again, the degrowth movement gathers people who are mostly connected to universities or have academic degrees. And then on the other hand, there's a CSA movement that is at least a bit more diverse in the sense that yes, as probably many of you know here, the CSA initiatives usually cater to people, particularly consumers, who have themselves academic degrees or live in urban areas. And also many farmers, particularly new entrant farmers, also have academic degrees. But at least in the case of Germany, I can say that the CSA movement also represents farmers who come from long traditions of smallholder farming, who come from families who have been doing farming for longer generations. And this latter group, these farmers, they identify much more with the language of the traditional peasant politics than with, one might say, more urban or more academic concepts such as degrowth or the solidarity economy. And then without being exhaustive, a last and maybe very obvious obstacle to our collaboration was simply that in Germany, the CSA movement is well organized. It has one network that represents the CSA movement in Germany, while the degrowth movement doesn't have one institution. And so when we spoke to members of the CSA movement, they were like, well, what's degrowth's address? Like, where do we reach them? And I think that's quite an obvious obstacle to collaborating. And yeah, these observations, we found out just last month, yeah, they're also in line with the bigger picture of a potential alliance between degrowth and the wider food sovereignty movement. So at the degrowth conference in Zagreb last month, we hosted a workshop on this topic, coalition between or alliance between degrowth and food sovereignty. And workshop participants came up with a list of potential obstacles as well. And so, for instance, they spoke a lot about degrowth jargon, so that was really key for them. And they also saw it as an expression of what they called an urban-rural divide between degrowth and food sovereignty movements. And they're talking about that. Participants also pointed out the risk of degrowth maybe taking the moral high ground. So degrowthers maybe even pretending to have the expertise to tell farmers how to farm. And they also spoke about resources. So they spoke about an inequality in resources between social movements on the one hand, and on the other, employed academics. And another central theme was the risk of degrowth to be either redundant and also maybe even useless. So the sense in which participants said, well, could degrowth maybe co-opt struggles that have been fought for long times and just use these struggles to apply for financial resources and engage with these struggles on a purely academic level, which would, of course, not have any useful impact for the everyday life of these practitioners. Okay, well, luckily, in my research, we also identified opportunities and reasons for the German CSA movement, I return to the case of Germany, to collaborate with degrowth. And so, firstly, concretely, the degrowth community can just practically support the CSA and also other radical food movements in whatever way might be most suitable for a specific movement at a specific moment, right? So that could be supporting them discursively in communication and advocating for the movements, but it could also be by together applying for grants, mobilizing further financial resources to movements that are structurally underfunded. And then specifically in the case of the German CSA movement, my colleague and I, we had lots of conversations about that because we saw that degrowth and the CSA movement, well, they had complementary political strategies, which then make them quite compatible, and I will explain it a bit more. So while the German CSA movement embraces food sovereignty, and therefore, as you saw in the earlier definition, also embraces this long-term goal of dismantling the global capitalist economy that is currently hindering the realization of food sovereignty. If you look at its day-to-day work, well, it focuses its main time, its main energy on the nurturing of an alternative niche that can survive within the current capitalist system. And that's an excellent pragmatic choice to make. At the same time, however, it can be absolutely useful to combine this strategy, which one can call an interstitial strategy, I use the terms that Jacob introduced earlier, with other strategies of transformation, such as symbiotic and ruptural strategies. So what does that mean? The degrowth movement can be a useful ally with its explicit goal of unmaking the current capitalist society, also through wide-ranging non-reformist reforms and revolutionary oppositional organizing. Why? Again, I think I now give more maybe concrete examples to what Jacob just shared now. If we look at CSAs, they protect smallholders from these pressures of the capitalist food economy. But the protective shields that they create are extremely precarious. Because CSAs do not only need to survive in a capitalist food system, they need to survive in a capitalist society. And so many of the mechanisms that CSAs rely on are constantly under pressure, are constantly threatened by the many ways in which capitalism shapes our everyday life. For instance, CSAs rely on lots of voluntary labor. So consumers volunteer to support the farm. But this voluntary work is threatened, for instance, by the burden of a 40-hour work week. Or just think in which CSA initiatives would thrive rather than only survive. Okay, so can degrowth be a valuable ally? We would say yes, but only if it actively reaches out and listens to the lessons and proposals from practical movements in the food system. And that's particularly relevant since degrowth and food movements have been observed to belong to sometimes different or even divided communities. So the urban on the one hand, the rural on the other. And it's true that sometimes urban environmentalist movements in the global north are alienating rural movements, are alienating agroecological smallholders. So particularly, for instance, when they propose decidedly urban eco-modernist solutions to the ecological crises that we're facing. So that is, solutions that put hopes in technological progress rather than into the practices and knowledges of agroecological producers. For instance, precision fermentation or lab-grown meat. But we believe that degrowth has a good position here to unite rather than divide agroecology and environmentalist movements. And here we can think back to the introduction by Giuseppe about the 7 critiques to growth, or multiple critiques to growth, that degrowth unites. So degrowth is not just an ecological critique of the unsustainability of growth. Degrowth is similarly a critique of the capitalist pursuit of profit, of industrialism and its alienation of people from their labor, the enclosure of the commons, and the destruction of autonomous livelihoods. So degrowth calls as much for a food system that is environmentally sound as for a food system that prioritizes people's autonomy, ownership and control of the land, tools and resources that feed them. So a food system that is determined by communities adapted to their specific contexts and needs, rather than driven by any universal model of how to feed the world. And so, degrowth has much to learn from the world's smallholders, the food sovereignty and agroecology movement, and from autonomous agricultural initiatives. And it can contribute to these struggles by being a reliable and humble and self-critical ally. And I think we just leave it here, also with a look at the time. These are just some, maybe takeaways that hopefully summarize a bit what we just have been talking about. And now we're looking forward to the questions.
I want to use this. Okay, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Jacob. It was great. Lots of food for thought. Now, this is a microphone, as you see. You can throw it. It doesn't hurt. It's soft. So, I'd like to open the floor. And let's take questions for Julia and Jacob. And I'll throw, and then when you ask your question, then you pass the catch box to the next person who raises their hand. Who would like to ask questions? Or to comment? There's one there. No. Try my skills, huh?
Thank you. I have 2 questions. So I was very, I think, moved by the idea also of co-opting, and I think it's something that I've also seen happen with community land trusts. I don't know if you know this, but this is also something that has a very long history, emerged out of the civil rights movement, and now also people in the degrowth movement are kind of, I guess, popularizing this idea and kind of erasing the history that it comes from, which I think is unjust in itself, but is especially important for a movement that emphasizes creating just futures. So I was wondering how you, as a person, the general you, but I guess also us, can kind of, make sure that we don't do the same thing. And maybe it's the same question or it's related to it, but I was also wondering, do these people need help? Did they ask for help? Because I understand the enthusiasm from your or our side, but I think that's also something to be super mindful of, especially with allyship. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I forgot to say something. Perhaps, can you say your name and your affiliation? No, everybody, right? Before asking the question. So I think it's nice so we also get to know each other and where the question comes from. Thanks.
My name is Esther Baar. I'm a policy researcher at the Rathenau Institute in The Hague. And I'm looking at agricultural transitions in the Netherlands.
Thank you. The other side.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're both very, the question of cooptation is a very important one. And I think it's not often enough asked in degrowth. And the point you raise about the possibility that it erases history, I think that's one of the fundamental points. I think the first thing everyone should do in engaging with another struggle is actually learning about the struggle, actually learning about its history and where it comes from, and also who carried it, the struggle, also in its initial phases when it was not known yet or not known enough. I think that's my first step, and this learning is individual, but it's also collective, and it's like reaching out and doing the collective homework.
I think this is too, yeah. I think these are super important points, and I guess as you saw from our presentation, we've been kind of chewing on them. I guess the question, do they need help, is super important, right? Like, is it just, does degrowth maybe just need them, but not in return? And I think that's also a question that we had in our minds a lot when we were doing the research on CSA. Because if you read a book about an introduction to degrowth, they will give CSA as an example of degrowth, very often. Whereas, that's not the case for a book about CSA. They won't speak about degrowth. And I think, that's also why we did that research, is that we wanted to find out, well, what do they want? And what do they need? And of course, right now, the CSA movement does not focus, does not have the political strategy that degrowth would maybe see, or that degrowth would propose. And I don't think it should be in any way about then degrowth is telling the CSA movement how to do it differently. But it is always about finding out what there can be in form of a collaboration. And that might be small things, right? So it might be helping out with things that they point out and say, oh, actually, right now, in the case of the CSA movement in Germany, there's a group of people who have been struggling with the feeling that many members seem to not be very political about what they do. And so they actually came to us and said, we are just setting up this working group about the politics of the movement, like the movement having a political identity. And so then for them, it was very interesting to have people who can just bring in some questions or some tools or some workshops, right? And that is any form of collaboration. It is about asking, is there anything that you need? Is there anything that we can support? And the other thing was financial support, right? It's about the way in which, if you're related to an academic institution that is interested in these initiatives, that you find ways to actually support with your research the everyday work of these movements or these initiatives, and to find ways in which actually your funding can be used in a way by them for something that they want rather than something that you want. Yeah.